Once you become more experienced and serious about comic book collecting, you'll learn that grading is a very important part of this hobby. And what you'll find out is that for more valuable comic books, the better the condition, the higher the grade, the more expensive it can be. And it can get to some extreme levels. So for this video, I'm going to go over different reasons or factors on why you would want to get one of your comic books graded. The company that I'm going to talk about is CGC Comics, and there are other companies like CBCS and PGX, but CGC is the first grading company to come on board for comic books, and like it or not, they're the market standard. Now, they're not without their faults. They've certainly had a couple rough years with a lot of negative incidents impacting their brand, but by and large, a lot of comic book collectors and dealers prefer CGC over other grading companies. I hope that even collectors like myself will branch and use other grading companies because competition is actually very important. And having a monopoly or the market share of a hobby or of an industry is probably never a good thing. Okay, the first factor. Ask yourself why you are getting a comic book graded. Is it just for a presentation and you can afford it? Then sure, go ahead. But I can probably argue that there are other more affordable, reasonable options to have your comic book displayed. Now, if it's to potentially sell a valuable comic book, and to get a better idea of what that comic book is worth, then grading a comic book is an option you should definitely pursue. So what grading does is that it establishes kind of a more accurate market value for a comic book versus one that hasn't been graded. And the reason for that is that you have one company that has a set standard of grading versus a collector or dealer that has basically their own grading system or however they grade. Let's jump in and give you an example. Here we have two copies of Contest of Champions #1. One is raw and one is graded. Now, if I were to sell one of these, I can, maybe put this on eBay or whatever and say that this is a 9.8. And it looks really nice. But the buyer who's looking at this may not have the full confidence of this copy actually being a 9.8 versus this that has gone through the rigor of CGC and getting graded. And when I did submit this, I felt that this was a stronger copy. And interestingly, this is a newsstand copy, which if this was the equivalent 9.8, this would be worth more. But I felt this was a very strong candidate as the corners are very nice. The spine is essentially, can't really see it with the glare, but the spine is essentially perfect and it's clean and bright. The thing with graded books is that there are, especially with popular books, there are established sales of books, and that can give you a good idea of what the value of this book is. Now, there was a bit of a risk in terms of sending this book because who knows, it might have come back a 9.6, and the value from a 9.8 to a 9.6, the drop-off is actually pretty substantial. But I felt confident enough that this was going to be a 9.8, and so I sent it off, and it came back a 9.8. But if I were to put this up on eBay, raw versus this would get substantially a lower price, just because the buyer is basically, they're not always going to be confident that what you are advertising as a raw grade is going to be true. You can provide very high detailed scans, but scans or images don't always show every single detail of the book, especially on the inside. So would I consider getting this book graded in the future? Probably not. I kind of like having a raw copy, and as well, the value of this book below 9.8, I don't feel confident enough that this can be a 9.8. I've got a graded copy. I don't need another one, and even though this may have enough value to warrant getting graded, that's fine. And this has been kind of an issue with this hobby for a long time before CGC came. Collectors and graders often had different standards in how they graded comic books, especially when it came to higher grade comic books. And what CGC did was they kind of set the standard. And I want to say on the most part, their standard was pretty strict when they came on board. And this gave collectors more confidence in terms of an accurate grade for the comic book that they were purchasing, especially for valuable comic books. Okay, reason number 2, or factor number 2, comic books should have a minimum value in order for you to get them graded. Grading comic books is very expensive, especially for collectors like myself who are outside the US. The cost can be for modern comic books, and that's 1975 and to present, it can be $35 to $40 a comic book. So my minimum value is $150 for modern age books, that's 1975 present, and $200 for vintage tier books. To me, it doesn't make sense to get a $20, $30, or even a $50 comic book graded when you're paying this much money to have them graded. And you may ask, well, how do you determine what the value of the comic book is? There are a lot of really good pricing tools out there that can give you a pretty accurate or a reasonably accurate value of the comic book. From something like this, which is the Overstreet price guide, or you can use an online resource like Go Collect or GPAnalysis, or you can even use the sold listings on eBay to kind of give you a ballpark idea of what the value of a comic book is. Now you may ask, how do I know exactly what the value of the comic book is until I receive the grade of the comic book? And well, the truth is, you won't know. So what I would do is grade the book conservatively. And that would be a lower grade than what my expectations could be. And it's always good to kind of like temper your expectations. So if a book comes back at a higher grade, you'll be quite happy. Consideration number 3, only get your key books graded. Now, what do I mean by key books? They are usually a comic book that has a major first appearance. It can be a first issue, or it can have like a classic cover or a cover that is highly sought after. So these books tend to have a premium over surrounding issues, and they are generally more easier to sell or more liquid, if you want to say. Now, you may have a comic book that's worth, maybe $100 to $200 that you think that may be worth grading, but you have to remember that grading a book doesn't necessarily make the book easier to sell. It kind of helps you ascertain what the value of the book is. So like a random high-grade issue of Avengers or Thor may potentially be worth, more than $200. But I'm going to say those kind of like run-filler issues are more difficult to move when they're graded. Now, there's some exceptions. And the exceptions that I would say are high-grade Silver Age X-Men or high-grade Silver Age Spider-Man, because those two titles are, I would say, so popular across the board that they're generally a lot easier to move. But in my opinion, they should be higher grade. And when I mean higher grade, they should grade 8.0 or above. When you're sending books off, you should have at least 10 books to send off at once. And the reason why I say this is just to save money. Again, grading these comic books are expensive. And if you want to reduce the cost per book that you send, then you should send more than one at one time. I've only sent 2 shipments of books, I would say, in the past 5 years. And each time I used the maximum allotment, which is 25 books. So I would even recommend getting closer to that maximum 25 allotment of books before you send your books to get graded. Because this is going to reduce the cost per book for shipping there and shipping back. Because, if you only send 2 books, you're spending a lot of money to ship them there and then have them FedEx back to you. So I would recommend a minimum 10, preferably more. That may be kind of tough if you don't have enough books to send. Another option potentially is if there's going to be a comic book convention close by where you live and CGC is going to be there, then you can go to the show and actually drop the books off, and you don't have to worry about paying the shipment to send the books there. Consideration number 5. Now that you've picked out some books that have some value, for modern books, $150 or more, vintage, $200 more, consider them getting cleaned and pressed. And the reason for this is once you get to the higher grades, the incremental amount of value that's achieved, which each grade, above 9, gets to be really high. I would argue maybe irrationally high, especially when you go beyond 9.6 to like 9.8, and now apparently 9.9s. This is going to potentially add an additional cost to your books, and I suppose you could spend the time and effort to learn how to clean and press your books, but that really takes a long time. But if you know of a reputable cleaner and presser, then this can do wonders in terms of improving the grade of your book. There are a lot of YouTubers out there, comic book YouTubers out there, that demonstrate how they clean and they press their books, and sometimes you can get incredibly dramatic grade bumps. So I've seen one case where one fellow had an X-Men number 101 that was a 7.5, and it got all the way up to 9.8. There's no guarantee that a book is always going to get a grade bump when you get it cleaned and pressed, so you should potentially consult or talk to your presser before that happens, but you should certainly make it a consideration, because the value increase that you can get from grade bumps, especially the higher grade bumps, can be substantial and can be totally worth it. Even for lower grade books, they may not be able to get a grade bump, but even just the increase in eye appeal can be worth it. Let's take a look at some examples of books that I would consider getting graded, and the reasons why or why not I haven't gotten them graded. So this is a copy of Tales of Suspense number 80, and should I get this graded or not? It's a really nice copy. It has actually a really great cover. It's a classic Red Skull cover. It's potentially worth around $200, so it's kind of right on the bubble. But the one thing I notice is on this very bottom corner here, there is a very fine, on the light, a color breaking crease. So I feel this is not high enough grade, even though in this grade it might be a $200 book. Actually, maybe not, because actually a lot of books have been going down in value, but this would, even though it's beautiful, it's got a great cover, it's not really a key issue in that respect. It doesn't have a first appearance of anything, although that does have a pretty good cover. So this, for me, would not pass in terms of getting this book sent. So this is a copy of Hulk number 180, and this is a book that I would certainly get graded. And the reason why is because it's a key issue, and it's a very popular key issue, and getting it graded would kind of give me a very good ballpark idea of what the value is, and like I would want to get a key book like this. If I were to sell it, I would want to get like the market value of whatever this book currently sells for. So, and getting this graded as well too would make the buyer comfortable, because this is probably north of $500, and books like this and the 181 are kind of notorious for missing the Marvel value stamp. So there's value there in terms of like getting this graded so that the buyer feels more confident when they purchase this book. So this is a copy of Peter Parker's Spectacular Spider-Man number 1, and this does check a few boxes. So it's the first issue. It's also Spider-Man, which is very popular, and it's probably worth around $150. Now, if it comes back a 9.8, it's worth more, and this is kind of right on the bubble. I think a 9.6 is just like over $100, but this didn't make the cut last time when I sent books to send off to CGC, but it's everything about it is nice. Although, even though this is from the 70s, this is actually a very common book in high grade. Very common book. Sometimes you can hear stories about people still having cases of this book, which may sound crazy, but it happens. This is a copy of Military Comics number 17, because I gotta have some Black Hawk content, of course, in this video. Now, the value of this book is probably around $200, but with Golden Age books, unless they're super high grade or a key of some sort, run-of-the-mill stuff like this, even though it may be worth like a couple $100, are generally not worth getting graded. And the reason is, honestly, like if you look at sales for stuff like this comic book, there are very few. It doesn't have a classic cover. It's not a key, and yeah. So I wouldn't get this one graded. So this is a copy of Young Romance number 150. Kind of like oddball books like this, but this has actually a very famous cover by J. Scott Pike, and it actually commands quite a bit of value regardless of grade, as long as it's presentable. Now, I don't know if I should get this graded or not. The value of this book warrants it because it's worth more than $200, but it's kind of beat up, and it's a lower grade, probably below 5. And these kind of books in this kind of condition can be kind of tough to kind of ascertain what exactly, because there's a few stains here. It's got some creases and it's a little dirty, but it still presents on the most part pretty good. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to sell this book, so I like keeping this raw and being able to look through it. So this would kind of be on the bubble for me. This book is actually fairly scarce. It can be kind of hard to find in any grade, and it's kind of one of the only expensive DC Silver Age romance books, just for its cover. So yeah. So this is a nice copy of Strange Tales number 167, which has a classic Jim Steranko cover. Now, it's in one of these kind of grades that's kind of hard to pin down because it's got enough little minor stuff around that can overall impact the grade. If I felt this book was a 9.2 or above, I certainly would get this graded, just because of the classic cover and it's a popular book. But it's got enough stuff going on with it that I don't feel confident that it would qualify for that grade. So I would not get this one graded. It's got some stuff going on over here. Maybe at some point, if this book were to ever jump in value, that, you know, if it's north of $200, I would consider getting it graded. But at this point, oh man, love this Jim. Look at that crazy Jim Steranko art. At this point, no. I'll just enjoy the book raw as it is. Okay, consideration number 6. Get a second opinion of your books. This is very important, especially if you're kind of new to the hobby or you don't know as much about grading. It's important to get a second opinion of your books to get a rough idea of how they would grade and whether or not they may be worth grading at all. This can be from a comic book store that offers this grading service. You can go to a convention and talk to a dealer. There are even online forums on CGC's website where you can post images of your comic book and you can get them evaluated by collectors and dealers who frequent that board. When you're talking about comic books that are worth thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of dollars, you should always exercise caution. You know, unfortunately, with any other hobby that has this kind of money involved, there will always be collectors, dealers that will try to take advantage of people who own comic books. And sadly, this happens in comic book collecting as well too. But really, it's useful to get an additional opinion because, you know, getting these comic books graded, whether by CGC or CBCS or PGX, is expensive. And you want to make sure that the cost that you're paying to get these books graded is worth it. Okay, the last one is learn how to grade. And this is maybe the most difficult one that will take the longest amount of time. I've been a collector for 40 plus years, and it took a really long time to learn how to grade comic books properly. And again, like, grading can be very subjective. One defect for one collector can be totally different for another collector in terms of how it impacts the grade. There are resources out there, and one of these days I'm going to get around to maybe creating a series of videos on how to start to learn how to grade comic books. But learning how to grade comic books can save you a lot of time and a lot of money. I want to give you a few more examples of CGC graded books and kind of discuss different things about them. So this is a copy of Marvel Collector's Item Classics #1, and often you'll hear, buy the book, not the grade. This is actually a book that I bought graded because I felt that it was stronger than an 8.0. It's a very strong 8.0 because there's not really very much wrong with it. And I've always wanted a copy of this book, and at an 8.0, this was super affordable. And you know, look at the stuff that this reprints: FF2, Spider-Man 3, you know, an early joy into mystery, and a tale so astonished. So these kind of square bound books are kind of notorious to find in high grade, and I was happy to pick this up for a better price because I felt it presented better than an 8.0. Excuse the glare, sorry. Yeah, so that's why I picked it up. You may have come across older labels. This is when CGC first started out, and this is one of their first universal blue labels. So you'll notice that they have the fine, very fine designation and the number, and this is smaller. So they moved to a much more prominent numeric presentation, which is better. So yeah, this is a weird DC Super Spectacular 100 pager #4. This is the first issue with a great Bernie Wrightson cover. This one I actually also bought graded. So this is kind of a tough book, but this is kind of, you may come across these kind of older labels that don't have the same kind of label I showed you before, where that looks at the worded grade, fine, very fine, beside the number grade. This is an old modern label. So it has a CGC Modern grade. When CGC first came out, they actually had a different color label for books 1975 to present, and they wisely decided to kind of not differentiate because it's confusing for collectors, right? Well, why is this kind of this maroon red label versus the blue label? And they did away with that. But early on in CGC's history, this one's got a crack in it, they did have this kind of other label. And this is actually my own personal copy that I had graded many years ago, and it was far cheaper back then to get modern books graded. It was like $15. And then if you had like your discount of 20%, it was like $12. So that's why I had this graded. Even though it's not worth a lot of money, I knew this was a high grade copy, and this is a Nirman Plus 9.6. And another interesting thing is, if you do come across these old red modern labels, chances are they are graded more strictly than they are now, because they may not disclose it, but they kind of grade modern books, especially even more modern books, harder than they do with older books. If you were to compare a grade from a Golden Age comic book to a modern book, you may scratch your head because they don't necessarily use the same standards. But this is the old modern grade label. So somewhere in between, they had like this kind of larger number, but they didn't designate the page quality underneath it. It was set aside over here. I bought this, I think, I can't remember, like years ago, but this felt like a weak 6.0 because it's got a fair amount of wear across the board. Sorry for the glare there. There's nothing hugely particularly wrong with it, but this felt to me like it was a weak 6.0, but you know, that's fine. It's fine. It's still a pretty presentable copy. Happy to own the first Adam Strange in Mystery and Space. And I'm going to show you. So this is an example of an older blue label. And what they also used to do with some of these, what you'll find in some of these older ones is, if I can get in there, they used to put down grader notes on the label itself. So this one actually has 50 written on first page in pencil. And they don't do that anymore. Raph, why would you get this Night Nurse number 3 graded? If you're a longtime collector, Night Nurse is kind of one of these oddball, obscure titles that fetch irrational amounts of money. I'm using irrational again. Yes, these can be very expensive and high grade. It is an absolutely terrible comic book if you ever read it. But, and it lasted like 4 issues, unbelievably. And, you know, I love this kind of like crap. And, but this is an interesting example where you actually see like the grader notes on the label itself too. And I just kind of want to show you an example of that. I have one example of a CBCS book, a book that I just got in a trade. I don't even care so much about this, but it's also using one of their older labels. They've changed to a new labeling system, which I do believe is better, but they could still improve upon that. And interestingly, CBCS has a reputation of grading stricter than CGC. The sad truth is, even though they're a very good company that grades strictly, books that grade by their standards, if you were to compare them to like CGC, their books sell for less. But there are positive things about their slabs, and one thing is that they're thinner. The new CGCs, or the more recent CGC slabs, are wider, so you can't fit as many slabs in a box compared to these. I kind of wish they would go through, like if you look at their older slabs like this, they're thin, but if you look at their newer slabs, they're thicker, and I wish they would find some kind of way of going back to the thinner slabs, because let's be honest, you know, if you can save space, that's always a good thing. Some more of my CGC books. One of these days I'll maybe go through a few more of these. But I only have about 90 to 100 of these, and that's more than enough for me. At the end of the day, in my opinion, over 99% of all comic books out there don't need to be graded. And there are even a lot of comic book collectors out there that feel that getting a comic book entombed in this plastic case is borderline criminal. And I get it, because, you know, comic books, even old, valuable comic books, are meant to be opened up, read, and enjoyed. And sealing this in a plastic case is kind of goes against every fiber of some of these collectors out there. But that being said, when you're dealing with a hobby like ours that have comic books that are worth a lot of money, and especially with older comic books and the services that these third-grade party providers provide, like Restoration Check, getting a comic book graded is an essential and important service. You know, the vast majority of comic books out there are not really that valuable, and they don't need to be graded. But I've seen like videos of people showing their comic book rooms and showing their walls with graded comic books, and yeah, they look great. It's something about having the presentation factor of a graded comic book that really pops. So there's that. If simply you just want to have your comic book presented in a nice way, certainly having it graded and put in this case is very nice. So what are your thoughts? Grading comic books can be a contentious subject. I own about under 100 slabs, maybe somewhere between 80 to 90 slabs. And I kind of have this kind of love-hate relationship with them. I understand the importance of grading, but at the same time, these things take up a lot of space and they're heavy. So I try to balance that. I don't want to have any more slabs than I have right now. Thanks for watching. In case you're curious, I do have more videos on comic book collecting that you can check out over here. And until next time, keep reading and collecting comic books.